It was a Tuesday night in early spring, the kind of night where the quiet in a suburban neighborhood feels heavier than usual. The houses along Pine Ridge Drive were lined in neat rows, blinds drawn, driveways dark except for the occasional porch light flickering on with a motion sensor. Inside one particular home, the ticking of a wall clock was the only sound until the rumble of a car engine cut through the silence. A black pickup truck pulled into the driveway just past midnight, headlights sweeping across the yard before shutting off. The driver's side door creaked open, and Marcus Bennett stepped out. He was 47, broad-shouldered, with the tired gait of a man who'd worked too many double shifts at the plant. He wasn't supposed to be home this late, but a canceled order had cut his overtime short. He had the look of a man eager to shower, collapse into bed, and pretend for a few hours that life was simpler than it really was. As Marcus walked up the front steps, a strange feeling prickled the back of his neck. The house was too quiet, but not in the peaceful way. He slid the key into the lock and paused. The living room light wasn't on, which wasn't unusual, but he noticed the faintest glow leaking from upstairs. A lamp, maybe, or something else. He stepped inside, shutting the door softly, and set his keys on the counter. For a moment, he just stood there listening. He thought he heard something, a muffled thump, then what could have been a laugh. It was faint like a whisper, and it made his stomach knot. Marcus wasn't a man prone to suspicion. He'd built a life on predictability. Steady work, steady bills, steady routines. His wife, Denise, was younger than him by 10 years. They'd been married for almost 8, and though the spark had faded, Marcus had chalked it up to the normal wear of marriage. Denise had a son from her first marriage, 18 now, a senior in high school, named Tyler. Marcus had tried to play the role of father, but they'd never been close. Still, Marcus never imagined anything more complicated than the usual step-family tension. He set his lunch pail down and slipped off his boots. The sound upstairs came again, a rhythmic creak in the floorboards. This time, it wasn't just his imagination. Someone was moving around. His pulse quickened, and before he realized it, he was heading for the stairs. With each step, the noises sharpened. Whispers, soft gasps, the unmistakable weight of a bed shifting under bodies. Marcus's chest tightened. A dozen possibilities flashed through his mind, most of them awful. Denise having someone over, sneaking around behind his back. A stranger. Maybe even danger. But as he reached the top of the stairs, he noticed something that froze him in place. The sounds were coming from his own bedroom. His hand tightened on the railing. His bedroom. Their bed. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He pushed forward, each step careful but unsteady, like his body already knew a truth his mind refused to accept. At the door, he hesitated. The faint yellow light bled through the crack where the door hadn't been pulled shut all the way. He heard a low moan, then laughter. His heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. Marcus nudged the door open, and in that split second, his world shattered. Inside, tangled in the sheets, was Denise, his wife, and Tyler, her son, his stepson. His breath caught, rage and disbelief colliding in his chest. What happened next would change everything. 8 years before the gunshots shattered the quiet on Pine Ridge Drive, the Bennetts looked like the kind of family you might see in a neighborhood flyer advertising community events. Marcus was already in his late 30s, a dependable man with a steady job at the steel plant. He wasn't flashy, but he was the type you could count on, working double shifts when bills piled up, volunteering to fix a neighbor's fence, never late with his mortgage. To people who knew him, Marcus was as solid as the brick house he lived in. When he met Denise, it felt like a second chance at happiness. She was younger, lively, with a smile that could light up a room. They met at a church picnic, introduced by mutual friends. Denise had been through a rough divorce and was raising a 10-year-old boy on her own. She carried herself with confidence, though, and Marcus admired her strength. He also saw in her the possibility of a family, something he'd always wanted but never quite built in his earlier relationships. Tyler, her son, was quiet back then. He clung to his mother and regarded Marcus with a wary distance. That was expected, Marcus thought. What kid embraces a new man right away? Marcus tried to bridge the gap with small gestures, buying him a baseball glove, taking him to a minor league game, showing up for parent-teacher conferences. Sometimes Tyler responded, but more often than not, he kept his walls up. Denise always brushed it off, telling Marcus, "Give him time. He's been through a lot." Their marriage ceremony was modest but heartfelt. Friends and family gathered in a small Baptist church on the edge of town. Marcus remembered how Denise's father shook his hand firmly, whispering, "Take care of my girl." And Marcus meant it. He'd promised himself that no matter what, he would provide for her and her boy. He thought stepping into the role of stepfather was an honor, even if it came with challenges. But blending families is rarely as smooth as it looks in wedding photos. In the early years, tension bubbled beneath the surface. Tyler resented Marcus's authority and often rebelled in small ways, ignoring chores, rolling his eyes when asked to clean up, slamming doors after arguments. Marcus, raised in a household where respect was non-negotiable, found it hard to swallow. They clashed often. Marcus would ground him, Denise would intervene, and fights between husband and wife became a regular soundtrack in their home. Denise had a way of shielding Tyler, excusing his behavior as just a phase. Marcus started to feel like an outsider in his own house. He provided the roof, the food, the stability, but when it came to discipline, his voice seemed to matter less. "He's my son," Denise would remind him sharply, as if Marcus needed to know his place. Each time she said it, Marcus felt a sting, like the bond he was trying to build wasn't just fragile, but unwelcome. Still, there were good days. Holidays where they laughed around the table. Vacations to the lake where Tyler seemed almost happy to have Marcus around. On those rare weekends, Marcus believed things might work out, that one day Tyler would come to see him as more than just mom's husband. But the peace never lasted. By the time Tyler reached high school, the gap between them had widened. Tyler grew into a tall, brooding teenager. He spent most of his time in his room, headphones on, door locked. When Marcus tried to talk, he got one-word answers. Denise often blamed Marcus for pushing too hard, telling him he didn't understand how sensitive Tyler was. Marcus, in turn, felt disrespected, undermined, and slowly pushed to the margins. Behind closed doors, their marriage began to fray. Arguments became more frequent, and intimacy grew scarce. Marcus noticed Denise withdrawing, spending more nights running errands, staying late at work, or claiming she was with friends. He questioned her, but she brushed him off, sometimes snapping that he was paranoid. In truth, Marcus still trusted her. She was his wife. Whatever cracks showed, he believed they could patch them together. What he didn't see, what he could never have imagined, was the dangerous undercurrent forming right under his roof. Friends who visited sometimes sensed the odd closeness between Denise and Tyler, chalking it up to a single mom's overprotectiveness. Tyler clung to her in ways that seemed less like teenage independence and more like dependence that hadn't faded with age. Denise, for her part, doted on him, cooking his favorite meals, excusing his attitude, giving him freedoms she never extended when Marcus suggested rules. Marcus thought it was simply maternal guilt for the divorce, her way of overcompensating. He had no idea how blurred the boundaries were becoming. By the time Tyler turned 17, the household was more fractured than ever. Marcus often ate dinner alone, the sound of laughter drifting from the living room where Denise and Tyler watched TV together. He would retreat to the garage, nursing a beer, staring at the walls, wondering where exactly he had lost control of the life he tried so hard to build. Neighbors noticed the distance, too. A friend across the street once told her husband she rarely saw Marcus and Denise together anymore. Tyler, meanwhile, was often spotted driving his mom's car around town, acting like the man of the house. To outsiders, it looked like a family simply struggling through teenage years. Inside, it was a pressure cooker no one could see. And Marcus, stubborn, hardworking Marcus, kept his head down. He convinced himself this was temporary, that every marriage had valleys before the peaks returned. He told himself Denise loved him, that Tyler would grow up, that patience would pay off. He couldn't have known that his patience, his faith, and his marriage were built on a foundation already rotting away. He couldn't have known that the very people he trusted most would one day betray him in the most unthinkable way, setting the stage for the night when everything would come crashing down. The trouble in Marcus and Denise's marriage didn't happen overnight. It built slowly, like water leaking behind a wall, quiet at first, then undeniable once the damage was too far gone to ignore. By the time Tyler was finishing his junior year of high school, the cracks were visible to anyone who looked closely. At dinner, Denise and Tyler often sat shoulder to shoulder, laughing at inside jokes while Marcus picked at his plate in silence. He tried to join the conversation, but it always felt like barging into a private world he wasn't welcome in. Tyler would roll his eyes, mutter something under his breath, and Denise would either ignore it or worse, chuckle along. Marcus wasn't a jealous man by nature, but the exclusion stung. He felt like a stranger in the house he paid for, an intruder in his own kitchen. The fights with Denise became sharper, meaner. They argued about everything: money, chores, the thermostat. But beneath each argument was the same root issue. Marcus felt pushed out, and Denise felt like he was criticizing her son. "He's my child, Marcus. He's all I have. Don't you get that?" She snapped one night when Marcus complained that Tyler never lifted a finger around the house. "And what am I?" Marcus shot back, his voice cracking with frustration. "Just a paycheck? Just someone to keep the lights on while you two play house." That line cut deep, but it was how he felt. The intimacy between him and Denise had dwindled to almost nothing. Nights once spent side by side were now lonely. She went to bed early, turned her back, claimed she was tired. On weekends, she'd make plans with friends Marcus had never met or take Tyler on mother-son outings, leaving Marcus behind. He'd stopped suggesting date nights altogether because she always seemed to have an excuse ready. At the steel plant, his co-workers noticed his change in demeanor. Marcus, once steady and quick with a joke, had grown withdrawn. He worked longer hours not because he wanted the overtime, but because it was easier than going home to a house that no longer felt like his. Over beers after a shift, a friend asked if everything was okay. Marcus just shook his head and muttered, "Marriage, man. You know how it is." But deep down, he knew what he was experiencing wasn't just the ebb and flow of marriage. It was the unraveling of trust. Then there were the strange absences. Denise started staying out later than usual, claiming she was running errands or helping a friend. At first, Marcus didn't push back. He trusted her, wanted to believe her. But when the pattern repeated 2-3 nights a week, his suspicion grew. Once, when she came home near midnight, Marcus asked where she'd been. She brushed past him with a sharp, "Don't start with me, Marcus. I don't need a babysitter." The problem wasn't just Denise. It was Tyler, too. By 18, Tyler had grown bolder in his defiance. He'd look Marcus in the eye when he mouthed off, daring him to react. Marcus tried to enforce house rules, curfews, chores, respect, but Denise constantly undermined him. If Marcus grounded Tyler, she lifted the punishment within days. If Marcus raised his voice, she'd rush to Tyler's defense. It was as if Marcus and his stepson were in a constant battle, and Denise had already picked her side. Some neighbors noticed the strain. Mrs. Caldwell, the older woman next door, once commented to Marcus that she hardly saw him and Denise together anymore. "Everything all right, honey?" she asked kindly. Marcus forced a smile and said it was fine, but the look in his eyes told a different story. The real breaking point, though, came from the small humiliations. Marcus would find Tyler sprawled across the couch in the evenings, Denise curled beside him, sharing a blanket as they watched TV. The closeness made Marcus uncomfortable, but when he mentioned it, Denise snapped, "Don't make it weird. He's my son." Yet the way Tyler smirked at Marcus over her shoulder told another story. It wasn't just teenage arrogance. It was possession, a silent message. "She's mine." The house grew colder, even as the spring warmed into summer. Marcus began sleeping in the guest room some nights, claiming he couldn't fall asleep with the TV blaring in the bedroom. In reality, he couldn't bear lying next to a woman who felt a million miles away. He'd stare at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the house, wondering if he'd already lost her completely. He tried to fix things, at least at first. He suggested counseling. Denise refused, insisting nothing was wrong except his attitude. He bought flowers, planned dinners, tried to reignite the spark, but his efforts were met with indifference. It was like pouring water into a well with no bottom. Nothing ever filled the void. By late summer, Marcus felt trapped in a cycle of suspicion and denial. On one hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was happening under his roof. On the other, the idea seemed so outrageous he forced himself not to believe it. A wife betraying her husband was one thing. A mother betraying her marriage with her own son, that was unthinkable. And yet, the tension in the air told Marcus that something wasn't just off. It was wrong. He started drinking more, nursing beers in the garage late into the night. He avoided Denise and Tyler whenever he could, burying himself in work or chores. But avoidance didn't solve anything. It only deepened the wedge. And the more Marcus pulled away, the more Denise and Tyler seemed to close ranks. The marriage that had once held promise now felt like a stage play where Marcus was the only one who didn't know his role had been written out. He was living in a house where laughter turned to whispers the second he walked in, where affection had been redirected to someone else entirely. He was a husband without a wife, a father figure without respect, a man standing on the edge of a cliff with no idea the ground was already crumbling beneath his feet. What Marcus didn't know, what no one could have told him, was that the betrayal wasn't a looming threat on the horizon. It was already here, alive and breathing, unfolding behind closed doors. And soon, it would erupt in a way that would leave blood on the walls and headlines screaming across the nation. The night it happened wasn't supposed to be extraordinary. Marcus had finished his shift early at the plant, a rare occurrence in a week that had been grinding him down with long hours and heavy labor. He clocked out just before midnight, rubbed the ache out of his lower back, and thought about surprising Denise with takeout from the all-night diner on Maple Street. Maybe, just maybe, they could share a late meal, talk like they used to. He clung to the hope that small gestures could still mend cracks that felt wider each day. But as he turned into Pine Ridge Drive, an uneasy stillness greeted him. Porch lights glowed faintly along the street, the kind of dim halos that seemed to trap the darkness rather than chase it away. His own house sat in silence, blinds drawn, one upstairs light faintly burning. He cut the truck's engine and sat for a moment, staring at that light, wondering if Denise had waited up. The moment he stepped inside, the air felt different, charged thick. He set the takeout bag on the counter, listening. The house was too quiet downstairs, but upstairs, faint noises floated down, muffled voices, then laughter. His jaw tightened. He thought at first maybe Denise was on the phone, watching one of her late-night shows with the volume low. But no, that laughter didn't sound like hers alone. There was a second voice, deeper, younger. Marcus's heart began to thud against his ribs. He moved toward the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. The closer he got, the clearer the noises became. A moan, a hushed giggle, the unmistakable rhythm of a bed shifting beneath two bodies. His breath caught. He froze halfway up the stairs, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to name. Someone else in the house? A stranger? An intruder? But the voices were familiar, horribly familiar. He reached the landing, pulse hammering in his ears, and followed the sounds to the bedroom he shared with Denise. The door was ajar, light spilling out in a thin strip across the hallway carpet. Marcus pushed it open, and in that instant his world collapsed. Denise lay tangled in sheets with Tyler, their bodies intertwined, faces flushed, their startled eyes snapping toward him at once. Denise gasped, scrambling upright, while Tyler froze, caught between shame and defiance. Marcus felt his knees go weak, like the floor itself had disappeared beneath him. His vision tunneled until all he could see was the two of them, his wife and his stepson, betraying him in the most unspeakable way. Marcus, Denise's voice cracked, desperate, but it barely reached him. The sound in his ears was a roar, louder than anything he'd ever heard. The blood pounded in his temples, and rage surged through him like fire. Every humiliation, every sleepless night, every time he'd felt excluded in his own home boiled to the surface in a single, unbearable moment. His hand moved before thought could catch up. The dresser drawer by the door was cracked open, where he'd left his pistol after cleaning it days earlier. He reached in and gripped it, the cold steel grounding him even as the rest of the room spun. "Marcus, wait." Tyler's voice cracked. "It's not, but it was." The evidence was right there, undeniable. Denise, her face pale with shock, tried to scramble toward him, hands raised as if to stop the inevitable. But Marcus wasn't hearing words anymore. His finger twitched against the trigger, and the first shot erupted like a thunderclap. Denise collapsed back against the headboard, a crimson bloom spreading across her chest. Her eyes went wide, uncomprehending before glazing over. Tyler screamed, lunging forward, but a second shot tore through the air. The sound was deafening in the small room, the smell of gunpowder thick and acrid. Tyler staggered, blood darkening his shirt, before crumpling to the floor at the foot of the bed. Silence followed, suffocating and absolute. Marcus stood frozen, the gun still raised, his chest heaving. He couldn't look away from the carnage before him. His wife, the woman he had vowed to love, lay lifeless. His stepson, the boy he had once tried to mentor, bled out at his feet. His hands shook violently as the enormity of what he had done sank in. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, the gun slipping in his grip. The house was suddenly alive with echoes, his own ragged breathing, the faint drip of blood onto the floor, the hollow ticking of the clock downstairs. Neighbors later said they woke to the sound of gunfire, jolted upright in their beds. Some called 911 immediately. Others peered through curtains to see Marcus's truck in the driveway, lights still off inside. Within minutes, the quiet street filled with flashing red and blue lights. Patrol cars lined the curb, radios crackling, officers moving in with weapons drawn. They found Marcus still seated at the edge of the bed, his gaze vacant, the pistol hanging loosely in his hand. He didn't resist when they shouted commands, didn't argue as they pried the weapon from his grip and pushed him to the floor. His voice broke when he finally spoke. "You don't understand," he whispered, tears streaking his face. "You don't know what I saw." Officers swept through the house, documenting the horror. Denise slumped against blood-soaked pillows, Tyler lying face down on the carpet. Their lives ended in the space of seconds. Photos would later capture every detail. The overturned lamp, the sheets twisted in chaos, the look of devastation frozen on Marcus's face as he was led out in handcuffs. Outside, neighbors huddled on lawns in pajamas, whispering in disbelief. Pine Ridge Drive, the quiet suburban street where nothing ever happened, was now lit up like a crime scene out of a nightmare. Reporters would descend on the neighborhood within hours. Headlines would soon scream across the country. But for now, in the early minutes of dawn, the scene was raw, immediate, and unspeakably tragic. A family destroyed, a secret unveiled in the worst possible way, and a man who had crossed a line from which there was no return. At the station, Marcus sat slumped in a hard plastic chair, wrists cuffed to the metal table. His work shirt was still stained with blood. His wife's, his stepson's, he couldn't tell. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their sterile glow making the gray walls feel even colder. Across from him sat Detective Carla Hughes, a veteran investigator with a sharp eye and a calm voice that could coax words out of the tightest lips. She'd seen her share of murders, but this one had a weight to it she couldn't shake. She slid a styrofoam cup of coffee across the table. "You want to tell me what happened tonight, Marcus?" For a moment, he just stared at his trembling hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, like each word scraped its way out of his throat. "I came home early, and I found them. In my bed, my wife, and my stepson, together." Detective Hughes didn't flinch, though the words made her stomach twist. "And then what?" Marcus's eyes brimmed with tears. "I lost it. I saw red. I grabbed a gun and his voice cracked. I didn't even think. I just pulled the trigger. Twice. It was over before I realized what I'd done." She let the silence hang, giving him space to keep talking. Sometimes confessions poured out when the quiet pressed too hard. And sure enough, Marcus kept going, almost like he needed someone, anyone, to understand. "You don't get it," he whispered, staring at the table. "For years, I felt shut out, like they had their own world, and I was just paying the bills to keep it running. I thought maybe Denise was cheating, but I never imagined." He broke off, shaking his head violently. "With her own son? My God, how do you even process that?" Detective Hughes scribbled in her notebook, her mind racing. If what Marcus said was true, this wasn't just a domestic homicide. It was a revelation that would explode once it hit the press. By dawn, the interrogation room had filled with paperwork, statements, and tension. Marcus's attorney arrived, advising him to stop talking, but the damage was already done. His initial confession was on record. The legal battle ahead would hinge on whether the jury believed it was a crime of passion or premeditated murder. Meanwhile, crime scene technicians combed the house. Photos of the bedroom captured every haunting detail. Denise sprawled lifeless against the headboard, Tyler on the floor with blood pooling beneath him, the gun on the nightstand. But investigators noticed something else, an open drawer at the dresser, where Marcus claimed he'd grabbed the weapon in a fit of rage. Was it already open, or had he pulled it out in anticipation? That question would become crucial later. Neighbors were interviewed. Most described Marcus as quiet, hard-working, and devoted to his family, though a few admitted they'd sensed strain. One neighbor mentioned how close Denise and Tyler always seemed. "Like best friends," she said, hesitating before adding, "sometimes maybe a little too close." Back at the station, Hughes tried another angle. "Marcus, when you walked in, are you sure you saw what you think you saw? Could it have been something else? Something you misunderstood in the heat of the moment?" His head snapped up, eyes blazing. "No, don't you dare. Don't you dare tell me I imagined it. I saw them. Her arms around him, his hands on her. They weren't fighting. They weren't struggling. They were," his words trailed off, his face contorting with disgust. "They were lovers." Hughes didn't argue. She simply wrote it down. By mid-morning, the press had caught wind of the tragedy. Camera crews camped outside the precinct, microphones ready as rumors swirled. A double murder, a family torn apart, whispers of an unthinkable secret. Officials kept their statements brief, confirming only that a man was in custody for the deaths of his wife and stepson. Behind closed doors, prosecutors weighed the charges. When Marcus was formally booked, it was for 2 counts of second-degree murder. The DA's office believed they could prove he intended to kill, but acted without premeditation. Still, whispers circulated about upgrading the charges to first degree, depending on evidence. During the arraignment, Marcus stood shackled before the judge, head bowed as the charges were read aloud. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty, arguing that Marcus had acted in the heat of passion after discovering the affair. The courtroom murmured with shock. Reporters scribbled furiously. Back in his cell, Marcus replayed the night in his head over and over. He saw Denise's eyes wide with fear, Tyler's voice cracking as he tried to explain, the recoil of the gun in his hand. He told himself he hadn't planned it, that he'd been blindsided. But another part of him whispered doubts. Hadn't he suspected something for months? Hadn't he been waiting for proof? The questions gnawed at him, even as he clung to the story of rage and betrayal. Detectives, meanwhile, searched deeper. They subpoenaed phone records, text messages, anything that might confirm or refute Marcus's account. And in Tyler's room, buried beneath notebooks and school papers, they found something that made their blood run cold, a leather-bound journal. The entries were detailed, intimate, and damning. Though the journal wouldn't surface in court for weeks, its discovery marked a turning point. For investigators, it confirmed Marcus's nightmare. Denise and Tyler's relationship wasn't a one-time mistake. It had been ongoing and consensual. But for now, in those early days after the shooting, all anyone saw was the bare bones of the crime. A man walked in on his wife and stepson, and 2 people ended up dead. Whether he was a monster or a broken man pushed to the edge, that question was just beginning to be asked. The discovery of Tyler's journal was like opening a locked door into a secret world no one on Pine Ridge Drive could have imagined. Detectives bagged it carefully, flipping through its leather cover with gloved hands, and what they found inside made even the most seasoned investigators pause. This wasn't just the rambling of a confused teenager. It was a detailed chronicle of a relationship that never should have existed. The first entries seemed harmless enough. Complaints about school, arguments with Marcus, crushes on girls in his class. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Tyler wrote about late nights when his mother sat on the edge of his bed, comforting him after fights with Marcus. He described how her touch lingered, how her words felt different, how he began to see her not just as a parent, but as something more. The entries became increasingly explicit, filled with longing, confusion, and eventually declarations of love. One passage, dated almost a year before the murders, stunned investigators. She says no one else understands her the way I do. I believe her. When it's just us, I feel like the man of the house. Marcus doesn't get it. He's never really been part of us. He's just a shadow in the corner. Another, more recent, was chilling in its clarity. We don't hide anymore. Not really. She belongs to me, and I belong to her. We know people would never accept it, but we don't care. This is our truth. Detective Hughes read the entries aloud in the squad room, and silence followed each line. Even in a profession hardened by years of brutal cases, there were few words to describe what they were seeing. It wasn't just betrayal of vows or an affair. It was a relationship that shattered every taboo, one that would force jurors and the public alike to wrestle with their deepest disgust and disbelief. The journal was presented to the DA, who understood immediately what it meant. Marcus's defense, that he'd been blindsided by an act of betrayal so twisted it drove him into a rage, suddenly carried new weight. The prosecution still had two bodies, still had a man who admitted to pulling the trigger, but the narrative was no longer clean. It wasn't just a husband killing an unfaithful wife. It was a man stumbling into a secret that defied comprehension. When news of the journal leaked to the press, the case exploded. Headlines screamed about the incest scandal on Pine Ridge. Talk shows debated it endlessly, hosts wringing their hands over how a mother and son could cross such a line. Some painted Tyler as a victim manipulated by his mother. Others questioned whether he had been the aggressor. Social media lit up with hashtags, arguments, and viral outrage. Overnight, Marcus went from villain to tragic anti-hero in the eyes of many. Forensic psychologists were called in to analyze the journal. Their assessments varied. Some argued it revealed a young man groomed by a mother who blurred every boundary until he no longer understood right from wrong. Others insisted Tyler's words showed agency, that he pursued her as much as she allowed herself to be pursued. Either way, the picture it painted was damning for Denise and for the legacy of a family already destroyed. In jail, Marcus was handed a copy of the excerpts by his attorney. He read them in silence, jaw clenched, tears brimming. When he reached the line about being the man of the house, he slammed the pages down on the table. "Do you see?" he shouted, voice raw. "Do you see what they did to me? How was I supposed to live with this under my roof?" His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder. "This changes things," he said carefully. "The jury's going to see this, and they're going to feel your pain. We can argue this wasn't cold-blooded murder. It was the breaking point of a man pushed past reason." The prosecution braced for the fallout. They knew the journal could shift sympathy away from the victims, but they also reminded the public 2 people were dead. However shocking the backstory, Marcus had chosen to end lives with a gun. In press conferences, the DA urged restraint, saying, "We cannot allow disgust at the victim's actions to cloud the fact that murder is still murder." But the damage was done. In every diner, office, and living room, people argued over who was guilty in the court of morality. Was Marcus a monster who should have walked away? Or was he a man betrayed in a way so grotesque that violence seemed inevitable? As jury selection loomed, excerpts from the journal spread like wildfire. Podcasters dissected each line. Tabloids printed sensational headlines. News anchors delivered updates with barely concealed shock in their voices. The case had already been tragic. Now it was infamous. For Marcus, the journal was both a curse and a strange kind of vindication. It proved the nightmare he'd stumbled into was real, but it also meant that every shameful detail of his marriage and home life would be laid bare for the world to judge. As he sat in his cell, the weight of it pressed down, not just the murders, not just the betrayal, but the legacy that would follow him forever. And in the courtroom, where the journal would soon be entered as evidence, a new chapter of the trial began. A chapter where the truth was even darker than the crime itself, and where a jury would have to decide how much sin could excuse a man's sins of his own. The trial of Marcus Bennett began on a crisp Monday morning, nearly 1 year after the murders. By then, the case had already achieved national notoriety. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps, reporters jostling for position as spectators gathered just to catch a glimpse of the man who had shot his wife and stepson in a story too lurid for even tabloid fiction. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, a mixture of legal gravity and circus spectacle. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Some came for justice, others for the drama. Marcus shuffled into the courtroom wearing a standard orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled until he was seated at the defense table. He looked older, thinner, his once broad shoulders slouched beneath the weight of months in county lockup. His eyes barely left the table as whispers swept through the room. Across the aisle, the prosecution team organized their files, their lead attorney, Assistant DA Karen Powell, exuding a sharp, controlled energy. She knew the world was watching, and she was determined to keep the case focused. 2 lives ended by the pull of a trigger. When Judge Denton entered and called the court to order, the trial began. The charges were read aloud. 2 counts of second-degree murder, though the prosecution had left the door open for the jury to consider first degree if they believed premeditation could be proven. Marcus entered a plea of not guilty, his voice barely audible. The opening statements set the tone. Powell stood before the jury first. Her voice was steady, deliberate. This case is not about scandal. It is not about taboos. It is about a man who chose violence. A man who armed himself, walked into a bedroom, and executed 2 people in cold blood. The defense will try to distract you with stories that are shocking, disturbing, maybe even disgusting. But none of that changes the fact that Marcus Bennett pulled the trigger twice. And for that, he must be held accountable. The defense countered with a very different story. Marcus's attorney, David Lattimore, leaned into the jury box, his tone impassioned. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine for a moment walking into your own home, into your own bedroom, and finding the woman you love in bed with your stepson. Imagine the betrayal, the humiliation, the horror. Marcus Bennett didn't plan this. He didn't stalk them. He didn't scheme. He reacted in a moment of unbearable shock, a human reaction to an inhuman situation. He is guilty of pulling the trigger, yes. But murder in cold blood? No. This was a man shattered in an instant, and the law recognizes the difference. The prosecution built their case meticulously. Crime scene photos were displayed, haunting images of Denise on the bed, Tyler on the floor, blood staining the sheets. Detectives testified about the pistol found in Marcus's hand, the open dresser drawer where it was kept, and the neighbors who reported hearing 2 distinct gunshots. Powell hammered home the point. Marcus had time to stop. Between the first shot and the second, he could have lowered the weapon. Instead, he chose to fire again. That, ladies and gentlemen, she argued, is intent. The defense, however, had their trump card, Tyler's journal. When excerpts were read aloud in court, the room fell silent. Jurors shifted uncomfortably as passages describing the ongoing relationship between Denise and her son were laid bare. Some jurors shook their heads, others avoided eye contact altogether. The words were graphic, intimate, undeniable. Lattimore seized the moment. This journal is proof. Proof that Marcus wasn't imagining things. Proof that what he saw was real. This was not an affair with a neighbor, or a co-worker, or even a stranger. This was his wife and her own son. You cannot expect any human being to see that and respond with calm restraint. It's not reasonable. It's not human. It's not justice to pretend otherwise. The courtroom became a battlefield of narratives. Expert witnesses were brought in, psychologists who debated whether Marcus's actions could be classified as a crime of passion. Some testified that the trauma of discovering such a betrayal could trigger a dissociative state, impairing judgment and control. Others argued that rage was no excuse for murder, that countless people endure betrayal without resorting to violence. Through it all, Marcus sat silently, sometimes wiping tears, sometimes staring straight ahead. He never took the stand. His attorney advised against it. But his presence was constant, a reminder to the jury that this wasn't just a story. It was a man's life in their hands. The closing arguments were a study in contrast. Powell stood tall, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "We are not here to condone what Denise and Tyler did. We are here because Marcus Bennett made himself judge, jury, and executioner. No matter how shocking their behavior, it does not justify murder. If we excuse violence under these circumstances, we open the door to chaos." Then Lattimore rose, his voice cracking with emotion. "Marcus Bennett is not a monster. He is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a man who walked into hell and reacted in a way none of us can truly judge without standing in his shoes. The law allows for compassion, for understanding, for recognizing the difference between murder and a crime of passion. I ask you, look into your hearts. Was this premeditated evil? Or was this tragedy born in the span of seconds, in the shattering of a man's soul?" When the jury retired to deliberate, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Hours stretched into a full day, then another. Reporters speculated endlessly on the outcome, analysts debating on cable news whether the Journal had tipped the scales. Finally, late on the second day, word came: a verdict had been reached. The gallery was packed as the jury filed back in. Marcus rose to his feet, trembling. The foreman handed the slip of paper to the judge, who read aloud, "Guilty of second-degree murder on both counts." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some expected acquittal on at least one count. Others had braced for first degree. Second degree was the compromise, a recognition of Marcus's guilt, tempered by acknowledgement that he had not plotted the killings in advance. When asked if they wished to poll the jury, both sides declined. The sentence was left to Judge Denton, who weeks later handed down 40 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 25. As Marcus was led away in shackles, he looked back once at the empty gallery benches where Denise and Tyler might have sat had life taken a different turn. His face was a portrait of exhaustion, of sorrow, of a man both punished and, in some twisted way, vindicated by the truth that had come to light. Outside, cameras flashed as the verdict was announced to the waiting world. The scandal of Pine Ridge Drive had reached its legal conclusion, but the debates about morality, about passion, about justice were only just beginning. When a verdict was read and Marcus Bennett was sentenced to 40 years, the courtroom drama may have ended, but the story was only beginning to ripple outward. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as cameras flashed in a frenzy. The words "guilty of second-degree murder" echoed across television screens, podcasts, and newspaper headlines the very next morning. The story had all the ingredients of a national obsession: betrayal, forbidden love, a double homicide, and a man whose breaking point had turned him into a killer. For weeks, talk shows couldn't get enough. Morning anchors debated the ethics of the case, while evening pundits dissected every angle. Some painted Marcus as a monster who chose murder when he could have chosen to walk away. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a man crushed by circumstances too grotesque for most people to comprehend. The Journal excerpts, read aloud in court and leaked online, fueled endless speculation. Was Tyler a victim of manipulation? Was Denise the one who blurred the lines until there was no turning back? Social media became a battlefield. On Twitter, hashtags trended for days. Hashtag Pine Ridge Scandal, hashtag Justice for Marcus, hashtag Denise and Tyler. Memes circulated, some darkly humorous, others viciously cruel. TikTok creators reenacted courtroom clips, their dramatic voiceovers racking up millions of views. True crime podcasts rushed to release emergency episodes, each offering their own spin on the case. Some focused on the psychology of incestuous relationships, others on the flaws of a justice system that struggles to weigh morality against legality. In the community of Pine Ridge, the shock was far more personal. Neighbors who once waved at the Bennetts from across manicured lawns now spoke in hushed tones. Mrs. Caldwell, who had lived next door for 20 years, told local reporters she would never forget seeing Marcus led away in handcuffs. "I thought they were just a normal family," she said softly. "Turns out we didn't know a thing." The house itself became a grim landmark, its blinds permanently drawn, the grass growing wild until bank foreclosure signs went up. Curious strangers sometimes drove by, slowing to point at the home where the unthinkable had happened. Inside prison, Marcus kept a low profile. Guards said he was quiet, compliant, often sitting alone in the yard with a book or staring off at the horizon. To some inmates, he was just another lifer. To others, his story made him infamous. Whispers followed him down the hall. "That's the guy who killed his wife and stepson." He received letters from strangers, some condemning him, others expressing sympathy, even admiration. A handful of women, fascinated by his notoriety, wrote to him with offers of love and companionship. Marcus rarely responded. The journal remained the case's most haunting artifact. Forensic psychologists continued to analyze its pages, debating whether it revealed coercion, consent, or some tangled combination of both. One nationally televised panel of experts split down the middle. Half believed Denise had groomed her son. The other half insisted Tyler's words showed he was a willing partner. The ambiguity only deepened the fascination, leaving the public to wrestle with questions that had no easy answers. For the families of Denise and Marcus, the pain lingered in different ways. Denise's relatives were horrified not only by her death, but by the revelations about her relationship with Tyler. Some refused to speak publicly, unwilling to have their grief consumed by scandal. Marcus's siblings, meanwhile, stood by him in interviews, saying they believe his actions were wrong but human. "You can't understand unless you've walked in his shoes," his younger brother told a news outlet. He saw something that broke him. Who among us knows how we'd react? The case also sparked broader debates. Church groups held discussions on morality and temptation. Law schools studied the trial as a case study in heat of passion defenses. Politicians even weighed in, some arguing for stricter sentencing laws in crimes of passion, others pointing to the case as proof that juries need flexibility when deciding punishment. Months after the sentencing, the story was still alive in American culture. A streaming service announced a documentary series titled Betrayal on Pine Ridge, promising never-before-seen interviews and dramatizations. True crime YouTubers produced hours of content, dissecting every frame of courtroom footage. Some creators focused on Marcus's stoic silence, others on the shocking journal entries, and many on the haunting question at the center of it all. Was Marcus a murderer first, or a victim of betrayal pushed too far? For Marcus himself, the answer hardly mattered anymore. In a letter written from prison, later published by a journalist, he admitted, "Every night, I see their faces. I hear the gunshots again. I don't know if time will ever wash that away. But I also know I'll never forget what they did to me, what they were doing in my house and my bed. People call me a killer. They're right. But they also call me a monster. That part I don't accept. I was just a man who broke." And that is how the Pine Ridge murders entered the true crime canon. Not just as a tale of bloodshed, but as a story that forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about love, betrayal, morality, and rage. For viewers of this channel, the haunting question remains, was justice served? Or was Marcus Bennett punished not only for the lives he ended, but for being the mirror that forced America to look at one of its darkest taboos?